in Afghanistan. I think it's safe to say that we are not, you and I at least, are not taken in by the promises of sweet reasonableness that we have heard from the Afghan Taliban spokesman. Tell me a little bit about what you're hearing from people on the ground that you've been speaking to in the last, since the Taliban took over.
Oh, everybody is extremely worried, and I guess you would have seen that from the awful footage that we're seeing still playing out at Kabul airport, where we have, you know, desperate families passing babies over the fence to US guards, and people still packing into that airport and trying to fill out any form they can to see if they can get out of the country. Women are especially worried, of course, about what the future holds. We know in some parts of the country, women and girls are being told they shouldn't go to school or they shouldn't turn up for their university classes. In some parts, women have been told don't turn up to bank jobs. In other parts, don't leave the house without a male escort. And even before the Taliban were in control of most of the country, they were enforcing very strict Sharia in the districts that they held, often forcing girls to stop going to school once they hit puberty. And while we're seeing that they're leaving the private news organisations like Tolo alone, and we've seen over the past week Tolo sending female reporters out into the field and female presenters even interviewing Taliban representatives, in the state-run channels, it's a very different story. And the Taliban have said, no female journalists, no female presenters, we're in control of this place. But I should say it's not just women who are worried. Of course, men are incredibly worried too. Anyone who works in a business that the Taliban disapproves of are at risk. And that includes, you know, musicians, artists, even lawyers, NGOs, and of course, religious minorities are also at risk. So it's a country that's completely on edge at the moment.
Yeah, and on the one hand, the Taliban says they will give amnesty to anybody who worked with the previous government. On the other hand, we're now hearing that there is an attempt being made to track down people who worked for the previous government. That does not end well, does it?
No, I mean, when you have people going house to house, trying to find, you know, critics and previous government supporters. I mean, even if nothing happens today, it's inciting this really terrible culture of fear. And when people are fearful and under threat, you know, terrible things happen.
Yeah. The big question for me is, and I don't know whether there is a simple answer to this, but the big question, it seems, is what is the Afghanistan that the Taliban want? Do they want to go back to the Afghanistan of 20 years ago? There is a sense among optimists, and such people exist in the West, that the Taliban is doing, I think the President Biden suggested something like this, that the Taliban is doing a little bit of soul searching and trying to figure out whether they want their Afghanistan to be connected to the rest of the world, to be part of the global economy. And the sort of underlying conclusion is that the Taliban do not want Afghanistan to go back to the 15th century, 16th century, 18th century. Pick your historical period that their country was in when they ran it. I'm not so sure. Are you?
No, and I think the piece that you had this week looking at, you know, whether, you know, while the Taliban might want to present itself as Taliban 2.0, you know, there's no indication that that they want to modernize. There's no indication that they want to join a global community or continue the civil society building that's been happening in the last 2 decades with the assistance of the international community. And as you point out, you know, the Taliban maybe trying to present themselves as new, but Afghanistan itself has changed remarkably in the last 2 decades, right? Yes. We're talking about a much more connected, educated population and a much bigger population too.
Yeah, more than double the population, so it's a much larger population. I don't think the Taliban's strength has doubled in that period. And of course, far more urban than they used to be. And as you pointed out, far more women in the public square than they used to be. So I don't know whether the the old forms of imposing the Taliban's will upon that population will work with this population. And which leads me to this really striking images that have been coming out in the last 48 hours of women in Kabul, mostly, going out into the street and protesting and not necessarily trying to conceal themselves while doing so in the open. And it's, you look at it from the outside and it seems almost recklessly brave. What do you think is firing this sort of show of courage?
Yeah, I mean, some of the women I've spoken to, particularly, former parliamentarians, members of the High Council for National Reconciliation, they are furious. They're furious with the Taliban, but they're also furious with the US and the global community for allowing this situation to occur. You had, a very powerful interview from one of the former politicians saying that the only word that the US should be feeling and that the global community should be feeling is shame.
Shame, yeah.
And I think it's women who've taken up their places as, doctors and lawyers and teachers and academics and, business women who've set up, tech companies and, who've invested life savings in running these businesses. They're seeing the place that they've taken for themselves in civil society that they've fought so hard for. They're seeing that sort of disappear before their very eyes, and they're not willing to let it go. And they feel that they have a right to get out there and say that. And you're right, the footage has been extraordinary. And in some cases, you can see them actually yelling at the Taliban soldiers standing in front of them. So it is, I agree. I fear for them when I see them standing out there, but I also think, go for it. This is the sort of resistance that will, that could capture both global attention, but also domestic attention and help fuel a sort of resistance to the Taliban's rule.
I think you're exactly right. I think you put your finger on it. I think they're counting on, or they're taking advantage of the fact that this is the moment to make themselves heard, at least worldwide. They know that the world is paying attention, and they want to make sure that nobody forgets. I'm a deeply cynical human being, and so I'm not at all confident that the world is paying adequate attention. And even if it is, that attention span will last more than a single news cycle. Another big question is what happens to all those aid organizations and NGOs and so on. So much of the Afghan economy was dependent on foreign aid. 75% of the national budget was funded by foreign aid, and so much of, so many jobs and the disbursement of money. What happens to those organizations? Are you hearing anything to suggest that they want to stand their ground and continue to do the work that they've done?
I think most organisations are just in crisis at the moment. They're trying to evacuate their very vulnerable staff. They're trying to get a handle on who's going to be running the country and whether they'll even be allowed to operate under the Taliban. And many of them will have had experience trying to deliver aid under the former Taliban rule as well. So, I think it remains to be seen what's going to happen with these aid organisations, but a lot of them were already preparing to deal with the drought that's happening in parts of the country, which is really, really affecting the population in terms of, any kind of food production, water shortages. People are already really suffering under those conditions, and to suddenly have those aid organisations pulled out would be a disaster.
Yes, a double drought, a real drought, and then, of course, a drought of financing and of money coming in from abroad. And that's the classic double whammy.
And I thought it was great in your column about, whether, the Taliban's taken over the country, but, can they take over managing the economy? It kind of made me laugh when I saw the central bank governor tweeting that apparently some soldiers had turned up at the central bank asking where the reserves were. And so I thought, how are these guys going to manage the economy?
That's exactly right. I've been seeing some reports that suggest that, the Taliban have been running parts of the country for many years. They know how to run parts of the country. They did run the country before. But as we've said, it's a very different country. It's a very different global economy, and Taliban and Afghanistan's place in that global economy is different. I think some of the calculations suggest that the Taliban were raising about $1 billion a year, mostly through drug smuggling and some tax levies on people that they ruled. $1 billion a year, but now they're running a country with a $22 billion economy with a budget that's around $6 billion. And there's a big skills gap. The Taliban don't have a cohort of economists and administrators who know how to manage a modern economy, and that's going to be a real problem. How are they going to have communications? People say, oh, whether the Chinese will invest and the Russians will invest. Well, I'm not so sure that they will put serious money down. I'm sure they'll say the words, but I'm not sure they'll actually plunk down their money. And even if they wanted to invest, who will they communicate with, and what faith will they have in these people who think the central bank has gold reserves under its floorboards? Who will they talk to, and how will they conduct business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a massive question. And of course, even before the Taliban took over the country, there had been a massive drop in foreign countries fulfilling their aid commitments anyway. So, you're talking about an economy that was already in crisis, even with all of the global assistance that it was being given. Take that assistance away, put in, a group of people who the global community isn't confident about speaking to, and how the economy will not collapse in a couple of weeks is really unclear. I mean, I was listening to an interview this morning out of Kabul where the citizen who was talking was saying that they're already about to run out of cash. The last time the banks were open was on the weekend, and even then they were open at very, very short hours. Now, the Afghan economy is a cash economy, right? Yes. So, when you have citizens starting to run out of cash, how do you buy food? How do you buy fuel? How do you keep generators going? How do you feed your stock? All of these basic how do you keep the lights on? What is the Taliban going to do to stop this cash flow crisis from reaching a real peak over the next couple of days?
Right. And I think it's worth spending a couple of minutes to dive a little deeper into this idea that the vacuum that is being left behind by the US and the West will swiftly be occupied by Russia and China, especially China. The Chinese have for several years been talking a good game about investing in Afghanistan. They made one really big splashy announcement 15 years ago, I think, about that copper mine outside of Kabul. Mm-hmm. Remind us what came of it.
Well, nothing came of it. They invested a lot of money in 2007 to get this copper mine up and running. They even got commitments from the Taliban to say that they wouldn't attack the mine. And yet it turned out that, a lot of things went wrong with that. First of all, there weren't the deposits that they thought there were there. Secondly, the bottom fell out of copper prices, and so suddenly it was a much less lucrative option to start with. And thirdly, they just could not get security in place enough to make it viable to run. Now, if they couldn't do that with US and NATO forces securing the country, then they're not going to be willing to sort of restart that process now. They've been burned once. And, the people I've been talking to say there's no way that China is going to force its state-owned companies to sort of go back into Afghanistan at this point and start trying to look at ways of investing.
Yeah, and that was a state-owned bank that financed that project. That was something in the order of $2.5 or $3 billion. That project, and yes, everyone talks about how Afghanistan might have $1 trillion, or $2 trillion, or $3 trillion of minerals and rare earths under the ground. But the problem is that it is all under the ground, and getting it out of there is going to require investments tens of times of the 3 billion that was in that one project. I mean, Afghanistan doesn't have a decent road network. It doesn't have a decent rail network. Getting all those minerals out of the ground for a start, and then out of the country, is going to cost vast amounts of money. And who in their right mind is going to invest that kind of money? So I am skeptical about whether the sort of big or medium-sized powers will want to get in. But how about local, regional players? I mean, how about Pakistan? India, obviously, very badly burned. A lot of the Indian investments at the moment seem to have gone up in smoke. Pakistan, any chances there?
I don't think so. I mean, Pakistan relies on China money to run its own investment network at the moment. So I can't see how Pakistan would be able to work out a way of strategically exploiting any resources in Afghanistan. I think, I'd be interested to hear what you think, but I think Pakistan is pretty satisfied with, the Taliban in power in Afghanistan, the US out, and India completely cut out of the process. I think that's a win-win for Pakistan.
There is a lot of schadenfreude there about the Indians and about the United States. I think a great deal will depend on who in the Taliban takes charge. I'm not sure the Pakistanis really want Mullah Baradar and his group to take charge, because after all, they held him captive and tortured him, I understand, quite badly, and he's not likely to forget. So they will probably prefer that the harder line people like Shirajuddin Haqqani and others will take charge. It's the old thing with Pakistan. You think you're riding the tiger, but very often it's the tiger riding you. But you're right, Pakistan. I'm not sure Pakistan has much to contribute economically to Afghanistan, nor to benefit greatly economically. If anything, it will probably put a greater strain on the Pakistani economy, especially if you have large numbers of Afghan refugees flooding across the borders into northern Pakistan. Sorry, go ahead.
So you were talking about the sort of factions within the Taliban. So what's your take on, who ultimately might end up, running the government from Kabul?
The short answer is I don't know, but I think there will be a contest. Right now, it would appear that the Supreme Leader, Akhundzada, has decided that he wants I hesitate to say more moderate, but the less extreme face of the Taliban to be presented to the world. So Mullah Baradar, the political faction, if you like. Those are the people who are holding the press conferences. Those are the people who were in Doha, sort of negotiating with the West. But I think that I suspect that the real power lies in the hands of the militants, the people with the guns, the people who have not been living it in comfort in Doha, but living in Afghanistan. And their attitudes are extremely different. And if they turn out to be the dominant force, if they exert themselves and gradually push the political faction out of the picture, then all bets are off. Then my greatest fear for Afghanistan is that it becomes a kind of almost like North Korea, sealed off from the world, where you have a ruling clique that are perfectly happy to wreak havoc on their own population, who don't care if the population starve, who don't care if the economy goes back to the 18th century, as long as the rest of the world leaves them alone. And that might even be the best case scenario, because unlike North Korea, there's a real risk that these same people then nurture within their midst, within that population, terrorist groups, extremist ideologies that are exported, which is not something we fear from North Korea, but that could be something that comes out from Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
Ruth, thank you very much. I think our time is up. Thank you very much for the conversation. I'm sorry that it had to be so grim and gloomy, but unfortunately, that's how it's playing out in Afghanistan right now. I'm sure we'll have other conversations, and I encourage our viewers and readers to join us. And in the meanwhile, you can read Ruth's terrific stories and opinion pieces on Bloomberg.com. Look for the opinion
Bobby's
section.
opinion pieces on Bloomberg.com.
Very kind. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Ruth.